A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, for over a century, the smartest people in the room were absolutely convinced they knew exactly where the world was headed. From Max Weber to Emil Durkheim, the consensus was that as societies modernized, religion would naturally wither away. They called it the secularization thesis. The idea was that science, bureaucracy, and prosperity would eventually make the concept of the divine obsolete. But here we are in March of 2026, and the data is telling a very different story. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the global prevalence of belief in God, and this supposed trend of secularization versus the reality of religious faith. It turns out that reports of the death of God were not just premature, they might have been entirely wrong.
It is one of the great ironies of modern sociology, corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way. The secularization thesis is essentially the most successful failed prediction in the history of the social sciences. If you look at the raw numbers from the Pew Research Center or the most recent waves of the World Values Survey, the global population is actually becoming more religious, not less. The mistake the early sociologists made was looking at Western Europe and assuming it was the blueprint for the rest of the world. They saw the empty cathedrals in London and Paris and thought they were looking at the future of humanity. In reality, they were looking at a very specific, localized anomaly. We are seeing a world that is more vibrantly, and sometimes more violently, religious than at any point in the 20th century.
It is that distinction between the West and the rest that really complicates the narrative. We tend to live in a bubble where we assume that technological advancement equals a decline in faith. But if you look at the global South, urbanization and modernization are actually driving a massive explosion in religious participation. I was looking at some data on Pentecostalism in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. It is the fastest growing social movement in human history. We are talking about hundreds of millions of people moving into cities and immediately seeking out intense, institutionalized religious communities. It is not a retreat into the past. It is a way of navigating the future.
To understand this, we have to look at the competing theories. On one hand, you have the classic secularization thesis from Weber, who talked about the disenchantment of the world. He thought that once we could explain everything through physics and biology, the magic would vanish. On the other hand, you have what Rodney Stark and Roger Finke call religious market theory. This theory treats religious organizations like firms in a market. When you have a state-sponsored monopoly, like the Lutheran Church in Sweden or the Anglican Church in England, the product gets stale. The clergy are basically government bureaucrats with no incentive to innovate or reach out. But when you have a competitive environment with lots of different options, like in the United States or Brazil, religious participation stays incredibly high because the churches have to actually provide value to their members.
That market competition idea explains the American exception perfectly. We are a highly advanced technological superpower, yet our levels of religious belief have historically remained much higher than our peers in Europe. But I want to dig into the mechanism behind this. Is it just about having better options, or is there something deeper about the human condition that secularism fails to address? You mentioned that secularization seems to stall when economic uncertainty increases. We have certainly seen plenty of that in the last few years.
The data from the 2025 World Values Survey is fascinating on this point. There is a clear correlation between what we call existential security and secularization. This was a theory popularized by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart. In countries with massive social safety nets, where the state provides for your health, your retirement, and your physical safety, traditional religious participation tends to drop. People feel less of a need to appeal to a higher power when the government is meeting their immediate needs. However, the paradox is that while participation drops, existential anxiety remains constant or even increases. People in these highly secularized, high-security societies are not necessarily happier or more grounded. They just find different things to be anxious about. And when the state fails, as we saw during the global supply chain collapses and the inflation spikes of the early 2020s, people realize that the state is a very fragile god.
That is where the social capital aspect comes in. Religious institutions have always been the primary providers of community and mutual aid. If the state tries to take over that role, it can provide the check, but it cannot provide the handshake or the sense of belonging. When the economy gets shaky or the social fabric starts to fray, people realize that a government bureaucracy is a poor substitute for a congregation. We saw this during the periods of high inflation and social unrest. People started drifting back toward communal structures because the secular state felt cold and indifferent to their personal struggles. In a megacity like Lagos or Sao Paulo, a church is not just a place to pray. It is a job network, a health clinic, and a security detail all rolled into one.
There is a demographic engine driving this that people rarely want to talk about because it touches on some sensitive topics. It is the fertility gap. Across almost every culture, religious populations have significantly higher birth rates than secular ones. In a world where many developed nations are facing a demographic winter with shrinking populations, the groups that are actually replacing themselves are the ones with strong religious convictions. Whether it is the Orthodox communities in Israel, which we touched on in episode 1336, or devout Christians and Muslims globally, the future belongs to those who show up. If one group has a fertility rate of 1.3 and another has 3.5, you do not need a miracle to see who wins the long game. The secularization of the West might just be a temporary demographic transition before a massive religious resurgence.
It is a bit of a cheeky irony, is it not? The very secularism that prizes individual autonomy and self-actualization ends up being a demographic dead end because it often deprioritizes family formation. You end up with a society that is very rational, very efficient, and slowly disappearing. But I want to pivot to the idea of believing versus belonging. We see a lot of people in the West who say they do not belong to a church, but they still hold deeply metaphysical beliefs. They are the spiritual but not religious crowd. Does that count as secularization, or is it just a rebranding?
That is the big question in modern sociology of religion. Many scholars argue that we are not seeing secularization so much as we are seeing unchurching. People are abandoning the formal institutions, but they are not abandoning the supernatural. In the United States, about 80% of the knowns, that is, N-O-N-E-S, still believe in God or a higher power of some kind. They might practice meditation, believe in manifestation, or follow various New Age philosophies. From a data perspective, they look secular because they check the no religion box on a census form. But their worldview is still fundamentally enchanted. They still believe there is a moral order to the universe that transcends physical matter. The problem is that this individualized spirituality does not produce the same social capital as institutional religion. You cannot build a hospital or a school on manifestation alone.
It feels like a very fragmented version of faith. You lose the shared vocabulary and the shared rituals that hold a society together. When everyone has their own private, bespoke spirituality, you lose that sacred canopy that Peter Berger talked about. Without that shared framework, how do you even maintain a coherent culture? We are seeing the fallout of this in our politics. As traditional religion recedes in the public square, secular ideologies are stepping in to fill the vacuum, and they are doing it by adopting the exact same structures as the religions they replaced.
That is a crucial observation. We are seeing the rise of what some call secular religions. They have their own dogmas, their own saints, their own rituals of public confession, and their own versions of excommunication. If you look at the intensity of modern identity politics or environmental movements, the fervor is indistinguishable from religious revivalism. Humans seem to have a hardwired need for a grand narrative, a sense of good versus evil, and a feeling of being part of a righteous cause. If you take away the traditional altar, people will just build a new one out of whatever political materials are lying around. The problem is that these secular religions are often far less forgiving and far more divisive than the traditional ones because they lack a concept of grace or a transcendent authority that can mediate conflict. There is no forgiveness in a social media pile-on.
And they lack the historical depth. Traditional religions have thousands of years of trial and error regarding how to handle human nature, guilt, and community building. These new secular faiths are being built on the fly in the middle of a social media firestorm. It makes for a very brittle social structure. I am thinking about our discussion in episode 525 about the clinical divide between faith and delusion. In a secular society, we struggle to categorize these deep-seated beliefs. If someone says they heard the voice of God, we might call it a pathology. But if someone says their entire identity is defined by a modern socio-political theory, we call it activism. Both are essentially leaps of faith based on unprovable premises.
The difficulty for modern governance is maintaining a neutral public square when secularism itself has become a competing dogmatic faith. The old liberal idea was that we could all agree on a set of rational rules and keep our private beliefs at home. But that only worked when most people shared a basic underlying moral framework derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now that that framework is dissolving in the West, the public square has become a battlefield of competing metaphysical claims. You see this tension playing out in schools, in corporations, and in the courts. There is no such thing as a value-neutral space. Every choice we make about how to structure society is based on some fundamental assumption about what a human being is and what the good life looks like.
Let us look at the case of cultural Christians in Europe. This is a fascinating category that has been growing recently. These are people who do not believe in the divinity of Jesus. They do not go to confession, and they might not even believe in God. Yet they are fiercely protective of Christian symbols, holidays, and the role of the church in national identity. They see the church as a necessary bulwark against the perceived threat of competing cultures, or the void of pure materialism. It is a form of religion as a boundary marker rather than a source of spiritual nourishment. It is essentially religion as an ethnic badge.
It is a defensive posture. They recognize that the cathedral provides the architecture of their civilization, even if they have forgotten how to pray inside it. This is very different from the situation in the United States, where religion is still much more of a lived, experiential reality. In the United States, faith is often about personal transformation and community action. In Europe, for many, it has become a museum of their heritage. But even a museum provides more stability than a void. The concern for many social critics is what happens when even that cultural memory fades. Can a society survive on nothing but consumerism and procedural rights? The data suggests that the answer is a resounding no.
The data really does point that way. We see a direct link between the decline of institutional religion and the rise of the loneliness epidemic and deaths of despair. When you remove the church, you remove the primary site where people of different classes and backgrounds interact regularly. You lose the weekly reminder that you are part of something larger than yourself. Secularism is great at providing individual liberty, but it is terrible at providing social glue. This is why we see religious communities being so resilient. They offer something that the market and the state simply cannot manufacture. They offer a sense of being known.
There is also the role of social capital in terms of tangible outcomes. Religious individuals are statistically more likely to volunteer, more likely to give to charity, and more likely to report a sense of purpose in their lives. This is not to say that secular people cannot be altruistic or purposeful, but the institutional framework of religion provides a nudge and a structure that makes these behaviors more consistent. It creates a community of accountability. If you miss church for 3 weeks, someone calls to check on you. If you stop showing up to the local shopping mall, nobody notices. That accountability is a powerful hedge against the isolation of modern life.
It is that accountability that makes religious groups so effective at navigating crises. During the recent economic shifts we have been tracking through 2026, the communities that have fared the best are the ones with high levels of religious trust. They have informal lending circles, they share childcare, and they provide a psychological buffer against the stress of a changing world. It makes them more adaptable. Meanwhile, the highly secularized populations often feel more isolated and more dependent on state systems that are increasingly under strain.
This brings us back to the secularization paradox. In countries with the highest social safety nets, religious participation is at its lowest, but the demand for meaning is at its highest. people are looking for something to fill the hole. This is why we are seeing a strange resurgence of interest in ancient traditions among young urban professionals in the West. Things like Stoicism, traditional Latin Mass, or even rigorous Eastern Orthodox practices. They are seeking out the most demanding versions of faith because the watered-down, secularized versions do not offer enough of a contrast to the emptiness of modern life. They want something that asks something of them. They want a religion that has teeth.
It is the cost of entry that makes it valuable. If a religion just tells you that you are fine exactly as you are, and that you should just be nice, it is not offering anything you cannot get from a Hallmark card or a corporate HR seminar. But if it demands a change in your lifestyle, a commitment to a community, and a submission to a higher moral order, it provides a sense of gravity. It gives your life weight. I think that is why we are seeing the decline of liberal mainline denominations, while the more conservative, demanding ones are holding steady or growing. People do not want a religion that is just a mirror of the culture. They want a religion that is an anchor.
We should also consider the geopolitical implications of these religious trends. As we discussed in episode 1336, the idea of a unified Muslim world is a myth, but the shared religious identity still functions as a powerful force for alignment. The same is true for the growing Christian populations in the global south. These groups are increasingly assertive on the world stage. They are not interested in the secular, progressive norms of the Davos crowd. They have their own values, their own visions of the future, and they are backed by growing populations and growing economies. By 2050, the number of Muslims globally is projected to nearly equal the number of Christians for the first time in history. Both groups are expanding rapidly, while the religiously unaffiliated are expected to shrink as a percentage of the total global population. The 21st century is looking less like a triumph of secular liberalism and more like a clash of competing religious and civilizational visions.
It really reframes how we look at progress. We have been trained to think of history as a one-way street toward a secular, rationalist utopia. But what if that was just a temporary detour? What if the natural state of humanity is to be deeply, intensely religious, and we are just seeing a return to the norm? If you look at the long arc of history, the secular period of the late 20th century might be the weird part, not the religious resurgence we are seeing now. We might be the anomaly.
That is exactly the point Peter Berger made late in his life. He was one of the original proponents of the secularization thesis, but he eventually had the intellectual honesty to admit he was wrong. He famously said that the world today is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. The only exceptions are a thin layer of internationalized elites and a few pockets in Western and Central Europe. Everyone else is operating in a world where God, or the gods, are very much alive and active. The secularization thesis was essentially a form of Eurocentric projection.
So, what does this mean for the average person listening to this in 2026? If you are trying to understand where the world is going, you have to look at the belonging metrics, not just the belief metrics. Do not just ask if people believe in God. Ask who they eat with, who they marry, and who they trust when things go wrong. Those patterns of belonging are the true indicators of social stability and cultural direction. If you see a community where people are still gathering every week around a shared sacred text, you are looking at a group that is going to be around for a long time. They have a survival strategy that secularism lacks.
Another takeaway is to watch the fertility data. It is the ultimate leading indicator. You can have all the cultural influence and all the media power in the world, but if you are not having children, your influence is a sunset industry. The groups that are willing to sacrifice individual convenience for the sake of the next generation are the ones who will shape the culture of the 2030s and beyond. In a secularized region, a sudden uptick in religious fertility is a sign of a massive cultural shift on the horizon. It is a slow-motion revolution.
And we should probably keep an eye on how AI-driven automation plays into this. As traditional work-based identities become more precarious, people are going to be looking for new ways to define their worth and their place in the world. We might be heading toward what some call a great re-enchantment. When the machines are doing all the rational, logical tasks, humans might find themselves gravitating back toward the mysterious, the ritualistic, and the divine. We might find that we need the sacred more than ever when the mundane is handled by algorithms. If a machine can do your job, it cannot save your soul.
It is a compelling thought. The more our lives are mediated by silicon and code, the more we might crave the touch of the ancient and the eternal. There is something about a 2,000-year-old ritual that an AI just cannot replicate. It provides a continuity that transcends our current technological moment. Whether it is a traditional prayer in Jerusalem or a communal gathering in a rural American church, those moments of connection to the divine provide a ground that the digital world cannot offer. We are seeing a return to the physical and the metaphysical simultaneously.
I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. It is a lot to chew on, but the main takeaway is that the rumors of faith's demise have been greatly exaggerated. If anything, we are seeing a world that is becoming more defined by its deep convictions, for better or worse. We have to learn to navigate a world where God is not just a historical footnote, but a central player in the lives of billions. The secular age was a brief chapter, not the end of the book.
It certainly makes for a more interesting and complex world than the one the early sociologists predicted. I find it heartening in a way. It suggests that there is something in us that refuses to be reduced to mere biological machines or economic units. We are a species that hungers for meaning, and we will find it one way or another. Whether that meaning leads to greater harmony or greater conflict is the challenge of our century.
Well, if you found this exploration of global faith trends useful, we would love to hear your thoughts. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We have covered a lot of these intersections before, so if you are interested in the specific friction between faith and democracy, I highly recommend checking out episode 1336 on the situation in Israel. It is a perfect case study for everything we talked about today.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping the wheels turning. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. It is the tech that lets us dive deep into these big ideas every week.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach more people who are looking for this kind of deep dive dialogue. It makes a huge difference in the algorithms.
We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep digging deeper and keep an eye on those demographic charts.
Catch you later.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth